Thank you for making time, Frank, and for joining me. I know, obviously, from seeing your posts and stuff, obviously, you've got a lot going on at the minute. You're incredibly busy. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah, you're right. It was incredibly busy. I did the BBC Late Show last night on the radio, and I do podcasts virtually every other week from all across the world. And I'm astonished by the interest that people have. But there you are. It's a decent story, I guess. Some kind of old timer like me becoming a social media
Yeah.
influencer. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that actually, because obviously, I mean, I've started this channel just recently in the last couple of months, but I actually work in media in the marketing team, and so I know how hard it is to actually grow channels and to actually do these things. So the
Yeah.
fact that you've been able to do what you've done at your age as well, when I even look at my parents and they barely can get around certain things on social media. So the fact that you've been able to accomplish what you have, is actually pretty remarkable, to be honest.
Well, let me just interrupt you there because I have absolutely virtually nothing to do with the technical side of it. My son Paul, who started all this about 3 years ago,
Yeah.
he does all that stuff for me, and that's great.
I first came across you looking at all the boxing vids that I get on Instagram and then on TikTok and
Yeah,
things like that. Now, I understand that I think you even got it in one of your sort of profiles. It might be LinkedIn or one of them. You sort of said, I didn't just wake up one day and decide I'm going to be a boxing coach. You were multiple time Scottish amateur boxing champion. So before we sort of get into it, I'd like to just start and ask you, what was it exactly that drew you to the sport in the first instance?
well, it was family. My two older brothers, Daniel and Dennis, were boxers, and they're considerably older than me. Dennis, 9 years older, Dan, 11 years older. And my dad ran a boxing club. So at the age of 4, he would take me down to the boxing club when the training sessions were on. And that's how I became interested in it. You just kind of, at that age, you're in wonder at people punching the bag and sparring and that kind of stuff. And it was just a natural thing. I guess it's pretty similar to the kids who are taking along to football games, or maybe the dad plays in an amateur team or a junior team or whatever. And so you kind of become immersed in it. And that was how it started.
That's interesting, actually, because I remember listening to, I think he was a former Olympic boxing coach for the US, and he said that one day he asked some of the boxers on the team, and he said, "How many of you in this room have issues with your father?" And he said almost every hand in the room went up, and he sort of said that actually a lot of the young kids that were there sometimes didn't actually have that father figure in the home, and they were looking for. I want to ask you about that a little bit later, actually, because of your coaching side for a little bit later. But that's interesting that you were first led into it first by your dad, and then obviously found a lot of success becoming a champion in the amateurs and sort of going
Yeah.
from there. So
Yeah.
who was?
Sorry. The thing about that, Liam, is that my dad never pushed me. He never pushed any of my brothers. And in fact, he made it very clear, if you're not going to do it properly, then don't do it.
Yeah,
Because boxing's too dangerous for
yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was going to say because for example, I remember when I was sort of boxing, at amateur level, I had sort of my favorite fighters that I liked. Ironically, I had the famous Muhammad Ali post, but actually I had read the Sonny Liston
Oh, yeah.
biography. And actually, Sonny Liston was one of my favorites when I was growing up. Not that I could, of course, emulate, his style. Who was it for you when you were boxing as a kid? Was there someone that you sort of looked up to and thought, gosh, I'd really want to fight like this guy. This guy inspires me.
Yeah. Well, you know something, I don't know at what age this happened, but up until a certain age, of course, I'm looking to my big brothers. My Dennis was a Scottish champion, boxed for Scotland all over the UK and Europe. Dan was a British youth champion. At the age of 15 or 16, he decided he didn't want to continue with it. And he had huge success. So that was fine. And that was it goes back to what my dad said to him. If you're only going to play at this, then best not to do it. And he said, yeah, I'd rather not. But my hero is Sugar Ray Robinson. And remember, in those days, we didn't have video or we couldn't see any of his stuff on a TV set or anything like that. So you would wait for the news of the big fights. I used to read boxing news every week and Ring magazine. every month. And you would look at the big fights and look at the pictures and read about them. And it really kind of prodded your imagination on those big nights at Madison Square Garden or wherever. The only time you were able to see them is if you went to the pictures, as we call the movies,
Yeah.
and Pathy Hughes would be on before the film came on, and you would see clips of the big fights usually at that point. And Sugar Ray Robinson was for me and for many pundits and those of boxing, he was the epitome of how a champion should be, not just inside the ring, but outside the ring as well. And I think that's part of the scenario that we kind of missed in modern day boxing, that dignity and humility and humanity outside the ring.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think if I'm not mistaken, I think you mentioned that you were lucky enough to actually train with him. I think he came to Scotland at some point when you were young.
Yeah,
And I think you've talked about this before, that you were fortunate enough to train with
yeah,
him and see him train and stuff. Obviously, that must have been pretty special because I think, as you say, he is pretty much seen as the consensus greatest
yeah,
of all
yeah,
time. And it's funny because I find that with a lot of other sports, for example, take football even, you can sort of say, oh, well, the athletes have come a long way, so as great as someone like Pele or Maradona or Johan Cruyff or all these guys, well, you can actually see that, a Messi or these guys, they've got sort of physical, advantages and attributes because of the training and the advantages
yes,
that they might not have had back then. But I find that with boxing, maybe, maybe with the exception of the size of the heavyweights, I couldn't, I mean, for as great as someone like, say, Terence Crawford is, I couldn't confidently say that I think Terence Crawford beats a Sugar Ray Leonard in his prime, for example. Well, and that's what's different, I find, sometimes about boxing with those great fighters. It doesn't seem to have, you know what I mean?
yeah. I do know what you mean, and you're absolutely right. I get this all the time from people who engage with me on the social media, who, of course, many of them haven't lived through that period. You mentioned, interestingly, Sugar Ray Leonard there, or any of the other four kings, and I'm the same. People say, "Oh, it's Terence Crawford," and Terence Crawford, I met him, and he's a lovely guy, and he's got the humility that you look
Yeah,
for
yeah,
in a champion as well. He knows his worth, he knows his value.
yeah,
But if you were to say to me, well, how would Terence Crawford go with Roberto Duran or Thomas Hearns or when they were welterweight, Sugar Ray Leonard and Hagler, all these guys, you think, I'm not sure that. Well, I am sure. I don't think he would beat them. And I think Crawford is the kind of realist who would recognize that and admit that.
yeah.
So, you get these guys who are saying, yeah, the present day fighters wouldn't live. Sorry, the older fighters wouldn't live with the present day fighters.
That's why I sort of specified maybe heavyweight, because that's the only area where they say, oh, okay, maybe could. And I think, look, I think we've seen that Usyk is the consensus greatest of this generation. But
Yeah.
I can understand why some people, and I've had this conversation with boxing friends of mine who are like, oh, but a 6'9", 290-pound Tyson Fury, would a 6'2" Muhammad Ali be able to beat him? I don't think so. They really struggle to see a way where these guys can win, but I don't agree. I think the speed, the smart, the skill set that people like him and in his era also, other guys like Foreman as well, I don't see a way why you can't make an argument that they could also come out victorious.
I mean, the heavyweight division is the division that captures all the imagination and all the attention. It's a pity because, generally speaking, certainly with this current crop and even in the previous generation of heavyweights, there just isn't the talent around in great numbers, far and away better than the rest of them in the division. We've got Moses Atalma, who's coming up. It's too early for us to say he's going to be one of the greatest, but if you look at the heavyweight division just now, it is real. There's a paucity of talent there. You mentioned Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury never lit my fire, never at all. I found him not terribly talented, huge, 6'9", 20 stone. That maybe was his problem. He was too cumbersome to be fleet on his footwork, to be punching in combinations. You look back at Tyson Fury and you see that, two punches at a time is about all he can manage. And then he wants to grab and,
Yeah.
and lean on his opponent and use that tremendous weight to tire, to suck the energy out of his opponent. So I don't think, if you look back at the great heavyweights, you go back to the 40s and 50s, of course, and
Mm,
people like me remember those people,
mm,
those heavyweights, and remember those. And you look at the talent, and of course, what's happened in the interim period is we now have giants
right.
of heavyweights. But even if you go back as far as Muhammad Ali, Ken Norton, Joe
Yeah.
Frazier, George Foreman, Ron Lyle, you know, you begin to doubt whether any of the heavyweights of today would live with those guys.
Yeah.
I don't think they would.
Yeah. Yeah, even exactly. And people like Ronnie Lyle, who was never a world champion, but was actually extremely talented and gave, I think, him and Foreman had a pretty much fight of the year in, a few
Oh
knockdowns to
yes,
teeth. And
yeah,
yeah, there was some tremendous fights in that era. And when you say the 50s as well, it's funny because I see. I'm a big fan of Rocky Marciano.
yeah,
My mum's Italian. I'm half Italian. A lot of people in Italy they'll jump on Italian American fighters. You're either going to get Ali Tyson or Marciano.
yeah.
In Italy, but he's someone that gets a lot of. He's sort of a very polarizing figure in the sense that he gets quite a lot of hate. People sort of, a lot of people love him, but then a lot of people are like, oh, his best wins were against old people. He never fought anybody that great. How do you see him? Because he does seem to be sort of have a lot of split opinions between the fans. How do you see
You know,
somebody like him?
yeah, you're right. He's a kind of forgotten man of the heavyweights, and it's only in the last maybe 5, 8 years that I have started to really appreciate Marciano. Now,
Mm.
he was the first guy who came on my radar when I was a kid. I remember
Wow.
vividly when he boxed a British guy called Don Cockle, who was a
Yeah.
British heavyweight champion. Now, if you look at Don Cockle, I think that fight ended in 6 rounds. Cockle was extremely brave up
Mhm.
to that point. He took everything Marciano could throw at him, but Cockle was a guy you could never describe as an athlete. I mean, he was all
Mm.
flabby and he was
Yeah.
overweight and so on, but he was extremely brave.
Sure.
But when you look at that fight, I remember vividly in the lead up to that fight, of course, before TVs were popular, we didn't have a TV at that time. And anyway, it wouldn't have been on. We might have had a TV, but it wouldn't have been on TV. But it was on the radio. I remember pleading with my dad, would you mind wakening me at 3 o'clock in the morning so I could listen to the fight on the radio? And he did that. And even listening to it and the atmosphere and the old style boxing commentators, it was fantastic. And it kind of whetted my appetite as if it needed that. What we talking about, I don't know, 1957 or thereabouts. But Marciano, given his disadvantages in
Right.
terms of being a heavyweight who was short, okay, 5'10.5" in those days wasn't terribly short, but what he had incredibly short arms.
Yeah.
He,
Yeah.
he didn't have a big reach. And so
No.
if you look at his fights with Jersey Joe Walcott, for example,
Yeah.
any of the heavyweights he fought, his strategy was simple. I've got to get in close.
Yeah.
And in doing that, I realize I'm going to take a hell of a lot of punches.
Yeah.
And so that showed his courage.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
showed his lack of fear, which is another way of putting it. And it showed that he was prepared to get as close as he could to deliver those sickening body punches that he had and also the hooks. If you look at the Jersey Joe Walcott fight when he won the title, when Marciano won the title, that
Yeah.
knockout is phenomenal. So
Yeah.
Marciano was a guy who I don't think was appreciated enough, given that he was regarded as just a bruiser, just a brawler. But there was a brain going on in there because he knew what his strategy needed to be, and he's able to carry it through.
Yeah. Yeah. No, completely. And that famous fight, I think I've seen the famous still image of that one where he lands that sort of the Susie Q and that there's Walcott's
Yeah,
jaw that looks all sort of you take someone like Willie Pep and you go and you see how many wins has this guy got and how many fights. And realistically, they almost were fighting on a weekly basis, some of
yes,
them. And I always think, how the hell were they able to do that? To sort of because when you listen to fighters in general, and I think this is true for boxing, kick, but mixed martial arts, whatever. But, as Michael Bisping said, and I said, it's not actually always the fights that are the things that destroy your body. It's the training camps, it's the sparring, it's the diet, it's the things like that. And you think, how are these guys able to put themselves through this sort of thing so often when in today's world, fighters are lucky if they fight one, two, at the tops, maybe 3 times a year is a lot for a lot of the top fighters, you know?
Yeah. Well, this goes back to the famous saying in boxing, the hungry fighter. These guys have to fight, put food on the table. So, they would take every fight that was offered to them. And that was their job.
Yeah.
Nowadays, you're right. And the big name fighters, look at the heavyweight division, or even guys like Terence Crawford. How often does he box?
Mm.
And you don't have to go too far back either to think of the guys like Manny Pacquiao. And he was boxing much more regularly than the current crop. But when you go back to the old days like Willie Pep and all the guys from that era, they were boxing, even Sugar Ray Robinson. I mean, Sugar Ray Robinson came, the time I met him, when he boxed in Scotland, he was 43. I trained with him. And he was boxing at that time every other week in Europe because he had to earn money to pay the taxman back home in the United States. And so these guys, that's what they did. And they were constantly in between fights. They didn't have to train too much. They just had to keep ticking over because they were boxing so much. And remember, too, that these world title fights in those days were 15 rounds. And many of them did go the distance, certainly in the lighter weights. And you look at, you mentioned guys like Willie Pep, and you look at what an artist he was in the ring. I mean, and his fabulous left jab, when in doubt, left jab out. That was his mantra. And so these guys have come through difficult times. They had to box. That was their job. They had to earn money. And of course, as we know, partly through bad investments, partly through unscrupulous managers and entourages, many of them left the game with not a penny.
Yeah. It's always sad to see, when you read up on them and see, oh my God, this person was a champion. I think if I'm not mistaken, even the great Joe Louis had to, one of the reasons he came out of retirement was for financial. Same for, I think if it was Max Schmeling as well, one of the guys, and the list is endless of guys, fortunately, who ended up in those kinds of situations. But
well, we have in Scotland a legendary fighter called Benny Lynch. Now, Benny Lynch was Scotland's first real boxing champion, world champion. He was a flyweight, and he was a phenomenon. And people get 10,000 people to come and see him out in the open in his training camp for his big fights. He was arguably the first superstar in sport. Benny Lynch died at the age of 33 as an alcoholic because his background was poverty and underprivileged. So he never was able to take himself out of that. He earned a fortune in his day. And sadly, that's what happened to him. There's hundreds of stories like that in old style boxing.
So on the topic of Scottish boxers, the one I liked was the guy who Duran took the title from at what was his name now? Ken Buchanan, that's it. Yeah. And actually, when you think about how good Duran actually was at lightweight, it's super impressive that he was able to have the competitive fight that, he did. And, another sort of overlooked when we think about British, because I think, I was recently in Wales, and I think if you ask the question there, who's the greatest British boxer of all time, they all say Joe Calzaghe. Other people say Lennox Lewis. I think there's a great argument for both as well. But, certainly there would have been an argument for Buchanan. He was a tremendous boxer in his day.
Buchanan, who's an ex-opponent of mine, by the way, I fought him. We boxed as amateurs, and then we became members of the Scotland team together. So when we travelled, we were roommates.
Wow.
Which was strange, given that we had this great rivalry, it's featherweights. But he was kind of phenomenal when you consider he was from Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, and Edinburgh was never ever a boxing town, if you know what I mean. Glasgow, on the other side of the country, that was all about boxing. That was all about champions. Jim Watt, Benny Lynch. Oh, the list is endless of guys who made it to the very top. Buchanan went into professional boxing and had this fantastic career until he came up against Duran, of course.
Yeah.
And Duran hit him well below the belt. There was no discrepancy there. And actually, a millisecond after the bell had rung. 15-round fight. This was the 13th round. Buchanan wasn't able to continue. Now, I'm not saying he would have gone on to win. I think he was behind at the time. But he was in the higher echelons of the boxing and actually is inducted into the Hall of Fame in America.
Yeah.
He was a special fighter. Yeah.
No, it really was. And as you say, obviously, you mentioned earlier about the fact that a lot of those fights were 15 rounds, and I think they changed it, didn't they, after the tragedy with Boom Boom Mancini and
Yes.
the Korean boxer who's
Yes.
his name I forgot, but they sort of realized, didn't they, that fighters were able, when they got tired and things like that, they were more susceptible to. But I wanted to ask you something, because I think, and I've seen you sort of post about this as well, where it's not a secret that I think you've said before that boxing is a force for good. I think on a social level as well. Well, at what point did you realize that actually there's a lot of benefit here beyond just the physical, beyond maybe just the health, getting fit benefit?
I guess that even when I boxed, I didn't truly appreciate that. Although I should have, because my dad ran various boxing clubs over several decades. And so I should have realized what he was doing for his, the different communities. What he was doing was he was offering a space and the chance to learn something different or special to young kids and to try and keep them out of trouble. And that's what he did. And when I look back, when I was growing up, the different boxing clubs that he had, I can remember young guys my age in their early teens and at that kind of difficult age, and even at 14, 15, 16, when they're beginning to go off the rails and getting into petty crime, for example, you begin to think, wow, these guys are different, but they're still coming and training every night. And then some of them became excellent and good youth champions before they found, alcohol or girls or girlfriends, and maybe they passed their driving test. You never saw them again. So what I'm saying is that for every one of those who went off the rails, there were dozens of others who didn't, because of the boxing club, because they felt, I'm part of something special here. I need to go and train 3-4 times a week. And actually, I need to be able to say to myself and to my peers, I'm a boxer. And that was something to be proud of. And so I think when you look at and I pay tribute to all those amateur boxing officials and coaches all over the world who open clubs for the benefit of young people, and now girls too, who come into boxing and feel, this is not strange for me, this is where I belong. And I love the fact that, these people are going through a system which keeps them, generally speaking, out of trouble, out of danger, and into safety.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think that's immensely true, because, one just has to look at, for example, Customato and how he was able to change, Mike Tyson's life, Mike Tyson's trajectory. And we talked earlier about Ronnie Lyle. He was in prison. Sonny Liston, who we spoke about earlier. And if it wasn't for boxing, these guys probably would have continued a life of crime, or would have continued to be. And it has been able to save many, many kids from poor communities around the world. This is obviously true of martial arts in general.
Yes.
When I was doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at a club in Streatham, the instructor had started an initiative which actually had come from Brazil, where they offer basically free jiu-jitsu lessons in Brazil to certain kids from the favelas and things, to try and encourage them to find the purpose in life, discipline, and it's, because I have, and I'm sure you probably had this argument many more times than me with people, but sometimes, I find myself having to explain to people, because, they say, oh, but it's so violent and it's so this and it's so that. But actually, for a lot of these kids that don't have these opportunities, it can end up being a lifesaver, and it can actually give them a life and a career.
You're right. And I think coaches who edge people under their care towards competing, when they realize that they're not good enough, or they shouldn't be there, or that they're in danger, I think those coaches are the ones we've got to sort out and think, well, hang on a sec. Perhaps most of the young people who go to boxing gyms do it to keep fit, to punch the bag, to feel part of a boxing community, but they don't necessarily want to compete because they're scared. And I get that. You know, I understand that you don't want to go and you try and encourage people, and I can see it in their eyes. You know, would
Mm.
you like to spar? Yeah,
Not really.
okay,
I forgot my
yeah.
mouth
So
guard. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You
Yeah.
know, so you know you can read the signals if you're a coach, and you just say to them, "That's not. Don't worry about that. You go and do
Yeah.
some stuff on the bag or skipping
Completely.
or whatever." So I think that's a kind of grey area, and we've got to watch that. Make sure that we're not pushing young people into the boxing ring for sparring or even into proper contests when really they're not 100% committed to it.
Yeah, when they don't want to do it. No, completely. I mean, look, it's natural to feel a little bit. I think I remember reading that actually Sugar Ray Leonard cried on his first spar. I think I
Yeah.
remember reading that story that you sort of, got hit a few times and cried, and you obviously turned out to be one of the best. Of course, it's
Oh,
natural
yeah.
to feel a little bit of fear and apprehension, but I think you're completely right where there needs to be that space for someone. If someone does just want to get fit and take out a little bit of, anger and stuff, that they can do that. We were sort of there talking about careers. Now, you obviously then transitioned into broadcasting, journalism. How did you get into that? What was the path into that? Because obviously you ended up spending a long time working in journalism. So what was the path into that?
Well, when I was young, about 18, 19, I was still boxing. I was traveling all over Europe to compete. I like the idea of journalism. Of course, the amateur team, the major newspapers of the day in Scotland and certainly in the UK was the Daily Express and then the Daily Record and Daily Mail. They would send boxing writers with the Scotland boxing team to places like Denmark, Italy, Bulgaria, all the places I went to. I thought that'd be a nice gig. However, I took a job as a trainee news reporter in a weekly paper called the Arbroath Guide. Arbroath is a fishing town 15 miles north of my hometown of Dundee. I trained there for a couple of years, went and joined an evening paper in Aberdeen, where I now live. And it was a big deal because the evening papers in those days were today news. You go out and it's in the paper that day. And I did 4 years as a news reporter on the evening paper, and in tandem with that, with the morning paper, its sister paper called the Press and Journal, which was the second biggest regional daily paper in the UK after the Wolverhampton Express and Star, right? So what did I do? I did 4 or 5 years on news on those papers. And then one day, the guy who was the editor of the evening paper said, "Would you like to go into sport?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh, I thought you might have because of your sporting background." I said, "Oh, I'm not interested." And I wasn't.
Really?
And he said, "All right," just that he said, "I need somebody who could go in and shake things up in the sports pages and, get to grips." And I said, "Well, I don't fancy it. He said, "Could you do it for 6 months?" I said, "Yeah, I'll do it. As long as I get back onto news. That's the deal." He was very clever. After 4 or 5 months, he made me deputy sports editor and gave me a rise. And so I was trapped. That was my way into
As
it.
you're
So
wearing
I
it.
did that. And then I went freelance and wrote
Yeah,
for so
yeah.
many papers. And then the regional TV station up here were looking for a first ever sports correspondent. And they asked me to do that. I worked there on the staff for 8 years, but I worked before I went on staff and after staff for about 20, 25 years as a freelance.
Mm,
So that allowed me to work for so many other people. I wasn't hemmed in by
yeah.
working for them. It was great fun. I loved it.
I can imagine. Nah, it's dream job right there. I've just got two questions for you based on that. What made you say no? Like, why at the beginning were you like, no, not interested? Given the fact that obviously you did have such a passion for boxing, what made you sort of want to, in the beginning, say, actually, no, like this isn't the
Well,
direction
I'll
I
be
want to
honest with you, I didn't have a passion for boxing. It was a phase of my life that I loved and think, well, that's gone. I'm not going to hang on to that.
Yeah.
And so my passion now is journalism
Mm,
and news journalism. I was so excited by every single day when I
mm,
was working on the newspaper because you would go in when you were on news, you would go in the morning and there was a diary on a lectern that everybody had to visit when they went in. and you get to see your initials were against any, so, High Court trial, murder trial, FG. Okay, I'm on the High Court today. No, that's because I had very good pitman's shorthand. I did 120,
Yeah.
and so the good shorthand writers would get these jobs like the High Court or the Sheriff Court. They don't have Sheriff Courts in England, of course. It's Crown Courts and Magistrates Courts. And so you do those. If there's a murder, a tragedy, anything like that, every day was different. Local authority meetings, all that stuff. And so I love that. If your name wasn't against a job in the diary, you were in the office waiting for breaking news stories or working on stuff that might be used next week or the week after, or writing features. So I loved that. I was kind of disappointed when the editor said, we need you to go on to sport. And
Yeah.
he wasn't forcing me.
Yeah.
I thought, well, I'm not terribly interested. Even when I'd hate to say this, but even when I went on to sport, I mean, boxing's only come back onto my radar in the last 3 years
Mm.
in terms of paying attention to it, because I was a football writer for all those years on newspapers as a freelance and on TV. Boxing was finished by then in terms of public interest.
Mm.
Nobody was terribly interested in what was happening in the boxing world. It kind of fell by the wayside.
Mm.
And so I was a football writer, working in Aberdeen at the time when Aberdeen became kind of champions, winning titles, European Cup Winners' Cup, and so on. And we had the interesting 8-year period of having Alec Ferguson as the
Yeah.
manager.
Yeah.
That wasn't altogether a pleasure, but that's the way it goes with football managers. There's going
Yeah.
to be the tetchy and, touchy about criticism or any sentence that displeases them. But
Yeah.
that's the name of the game. Yeah.
Would you say that that chapter, as you said, was kind of you'd moved on with the boxing and stuff? But I'm curious, was there any element of the training, the psychological aspects of the discipline, the commitment that helped you in your sort of journalism, broadcasting career?
Well, maybe it was hidden. I don't think I necessarily got this from boxing, but it's a key thing in boxing, as far as I'm concerned, and that is having respect for other people
Mm.
and listening to their point of view and allowing them to say what they have to say without interruption and so on. And you might have a different view, but it doesn't mean to say that you can't be friends.
Yeah.
It's just a different kind of ethos.
Yeah.
And so I suppose I got that from boxing and the fact that you have to turn up. You have to turn up on time, you have to train, you have to carry out your routine as best you can.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't feel like it. I mean, I hated road work, for example. I don't know
Yeah.
if boxers do road work anymore.
Yeah.
It was just
Yeah.
old clothes, lots of them to make you sweat. And what we called tackety boots, which were big black hobnail boots that they wore in the army. We wore them for running. And so the thinking on that was, well, they will build your legs up. And when you get into the ring, you will kind of float like a butterfly and
Yeah.
all that stuff. It didn't work.
Yeah. So, I guess one of the questions was you mentioned the passion kind of came back in the last few years. What was it that made you then think, you know what, I'll come back as a coach? Was it because you realized, well, you know what, I actually do have all this experience that I can share? Is that what it was that sort of prompted you to come back and say, you know what, let's coach now?
Yeah, probably partly that, Liam. It happened by accident. We were in the gym one day, my son and I, Paul, who runs the show for me, and Paul said to me, "Show me how to throw an uppercut."
Yeah.
Yeah, and I said, "Okay," and I did that, and he's filming it, and he said, "I'm going to put this on TikTok," and I said, "Great." I'd never seen TikTok. I knew about it, but I hadn't seen it. He put it on TikTok, and then next time we were in the gym, he said, "Show me how to throw a jab or whatever." I did that. He put that, and suddenly, like wildfire, it spread. And within a few weeks, I was up to 50,000 followers and then 70,000 and so on. I never set out to be a boxing coach.
Mm.
I did recognize that I had much to offer.
Yeah.
I think maybe my broadcasting career helped as well. How to keep your instruction uncomplicated. I started watching social media coaches. And I became abhorred by what I was seeing. I was thinking, hang on, that's not how you do it. You know, this is completely foreign to me.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to say that's not the way you do it. This is how you do it,
Yeah.
in my view, right? And so that's how it came about. And I started, I did recognize that I had a talent, if you like, for explaining things
Mm.
and show, and this is the key thing as well, being able to demonstrate.
Yeah.
So I'm not just one of these coaches that says, do this, bang, bang, bang.
Yeah.
Do that, and I need to show you how to do it. I need to show you in real time, slowly,
Yeah.
and I need to show you, the why we're doing this is a key thing as well, Liam. Why are we doing that? There's
Yeah.
a reason why we do this stuff. And I found that coaches, I mean, I've been in amateur gyms all over the world. I recognize that there are many coaches who know what they're doing, but they can't explain it.
Yeah.
And so I have the benefit, I think, and this is what the feedback tells me on the comments and the engagement. I have the wherewithal to be able to say, this is how we do it. We do it slowly. And when we master how it's done, we improve by bringing in speed. And then in the end,
Yeah.
we bring in power. Yeah, and then that's not the finish. You need to do that every
Yeah.
time you're in the
Yeah.
ring, every time you're in the gym, so that it locks into your DNA and it becomes intuition.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I scored. And allow me to say this, the level of engagement I get on the 3 channels I have, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, has been quite overwhelming, where people actually, it's kind of very humbling because people are saying things like, for example, on Instagram, we start to do a thing called, well, hang on a second, this guy's 79 and he's still training.
Yeah.
And in my view, I'm training at a decent level. I say that because I compare myself with young guys in the gym who will not put in the
Yeah.
hard work that I do.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of annoys me, and sometimes I have to pull myself back. I think to young people, hang on a second, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You've only got an hour and a half in the gym. You've got to give it an hour and a
Got to
half
give
worth
your
of
all.
real work,
Yeah.
effort. Now, we started a thing called Never Give Up on Yourself on Instagram. And it's the people who are out there, middle-aged, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, who haven't done any physical exercise for years, maybe decades. And I'm saying to them, you're giving up. Never give up on yourself.
Yeah.
Go out, join a gym, go for a walk, open the front door, walk out for half an hour, and then turn around and come back.
Yeah.
Then do double the time next week, and so on.
Yeah.
And so what I find is that people are coming back to me and saying, you inspire me.
Yeah.
I've been on the couch for years. I've been on my phone all the time. I'm gaming, all that stuff. But now, thanks to you, I'm going out and I'm exercising.
Yeah.
Now, that's brilliant for me. And the ones who have said to me, and there are many, you saved my life. I've had addicts who have said, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a drug addict. I've been watching your videos now for several months and I've thought, listen, this guy's 79, he's doing it. I can at least give it a go. And that's all I'm trying to get people to do. Give it a go.
And I have to say, Frank, to be honest, I think you've been overwhelmingly successful because, even I look at your vids and I think, gosh, like, when I'm half his age, I would still love to be, if I can be even like 10 years younger and still doing half the things that you're doing now, I would be content with myself because I think what you're doing and what you're showing is completely inspirational. I think that's the secret. Sometimes, like I even have conversations when my parents or family would say, "Oh, but you're getting on a bit. You can't still do the same things,
Yeah.
that you did." But I think that sometimes is the downfall, especially in Western society.
Well, you're right. You can't do what you did when you were younger, but you can do something.
Yes,
So
exactly.
what I'm saying to people is, look, if you just do it within your own limits, right? Whether it's walking or swimming or something. Well, there's my wife is every day,
Yeah,
73, and she goes for a swim every day at the health club along the road, and she never misses.
yeah,
She's been doing this for years and years and years. She just won't give up. And why should she? And so that's the point I'm making.
yeah,
Do something within your limits.
yeah.
even if it's a
Absolutely.
swim, you know, anything that will
Yeah.
keep the body moving.
The journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step, but you've got to start
Yeah,
somewhere. And just to touch on what you were saying earlier, I think one thing that, apart from the fact that people see, oh, wow, look at this person this age who's still out there doing this, how inspirational. I think one of the other things I've noticed, especially looking at the comments, is how respected you are. You know, you sort of read the comments, and people are like, wow, look at the respect. And because I've been in many classes where sometimes when the instructor's trying to teach and things like that, people are nattering and they're chatting and stuff, and I'm thinking, bloody hell, I'm here to listen. So hang on a second, shut up, because I want to listen. But when you look at your videos, everyone's in complete silence, giving you their full
yeah,
attention, 100%
yeah,
attention. They're
yeah,
they're trying to absorb like your lessons from decades of experience and stuff. And I think
yeah.
that's something that comes across quite strongly, actually.
And the thing is, right now, I'm doing weekly seminars with guys who are MMA fighters.
Mm,
And they've come to me. Now, I've had a few of these
mm,
gyms come to me and say, can you come and do a seminar? And you guys are not into boxing. Well, we are. We need to
yeah,
learn how to box
yeah,
properly
yeah.
as part of our
Part of the
discipline.
mixed martial arts.
Yes. So right now, I'm doing Sunday mornings at a local gym here. And it's interesting because every single one of those guys, there must be about maybe 15 or 20 of them, is East European. And they're into mixed martial arts, and that's what their gym does. And I go along to show them the boxing component of what they do. And I love the attention that they pay to what I'm saying.
Yeah,
But then
yeah,
that's because they're all kind of
that's,
adults.
yeah,
You sometimes get with teenagers when you're trying to explain this is why we're doing it. And
yeah.
sometimes you see their eyes are going like that, kind of glazed over, and they're
Yeah,
looking at somebody over there and they're waving and
yeah,
all that. You think, oh, right, okay.
yeah. I've lost him here. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's funny. No, but no, honestly, Frank, listen, I've I've taken enough of your time already.
Because I'm a terrible one for over answering the
No,
question.
not at all. Honestly, like Frank, it's been amazing. Obviously, being able to have this chat with you, hearing a bit of
Thank
your
you.
story. Obviously, I know that there's so much more to hear, and who knows, maybe in the future we can have another one of these. But no, genuinely, thank you for just not only sharing your knowledge with me, but what you're putting out there into the wider world. Because I also completely believe and agree with you that boxing and martial arts is a change for good. It can change people's lives, and I think people see you're proving that you are very evidently changing people's lives. Thank you for that. And thank you for inspiring, myself and many, many others. And I hope to continue and to be like you one day at your age. I still want to be hitting bags. I still want to be skipping like you. So thank you for that, for showing the example and showing the way.
Thank you, Liam. One thing,
Yep.
you're very good at this.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you so much.
you, you know, I get so many guys who come on to do interviews and they haven't got the flow or the fluidity that you've got. You know, like conversational. They're kind of looking down for the next question, kind of thing. They're not really listening. So you're good at that. Well
Oh,
done.
well, coming from you, that means a lot. Trust me, that means a lot coming from you. So I really appreciate that. So thank you so much,
Okay.
Frank. Honestly, it's been a pleasure. Take care,
All the
mate.
best to you,
All the
Liam.
best, yeah? We'll speak
Thanks
soon.
again.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye bye. Bye.